Mr. Andrew Roberts, David Cannadine, Shrabani Basu, Pavan Varma, in conversation with Swapan Dasgupta. I would again request you all to please put your cell phones on silent mode. In case you have any photos and videos, please do share with the hashtag ZGLF. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this somewhat improvised session on Winston Churchill. It was improvised at the last minute, no doubt because we are quite fortunate to have Andrew Roberts, who's written a book called Eminent Churchillian. Some of you may have read or not read, or at least heard of, or positively or otherwise. We've also got David Cannadine, who's the editor of the Oxford National Biography series. I'm probably getting it all wrong. It's about right. And he's been you may have read his book on ornamentalism, which is about empire, which is quite a fascinating book, especially when you look at the trappings of the Diggi Palace and the city of Jaipur. On my left also is Pavan Varma, a former colleague at various places at St. Stephen's and in Parliament, etc. Pavan has written extensively on the Indian middle class, the Indian mentality, etc. And finally, another historian, Shrabani Basu, who you may have heard earlier in the day talking about Queen Victoria. She's also written, her latest book is on Indian participation in World War I. So we've got a fairly mixed bag of people. And on a subject, I don't want to specifically confine this subject to India, because I think India was a footnote in the career of Winston Churchill. Some would say a bloody footnote. All the same, I think Winston Churchill's life, spanning both right from his escapades in the Boer War, right down to his tenure as Prime Minister for an inordinately long time, perhaps a lot of people would say longer than he should have really served, has been quite fascinating. I can remember in India, it's been quite in 1965 when he died and I was 10 years old and in school, I'd never heard of the man called Winston Churchill, but there was quite a stir at that time. And and in India, which is supposed to be a place where Churchill was reviled and hated, but the outpouring of interest, and in some cases sadness, struck me as quite interesting. So Churchill was probably a very complex character, and how he was received both at home, in the rest of the so-called empire, Commonwealth, call it whatever you want to, is quite fascinating. So hero or villain, perhaps it's too stark a choice, but let me start off with you, Andrew Roberts, by giving a sort of potted assessment of what you think of Churchill, his legacy, etc.
I don't think it is thank you very much indeed, those kind words. I don't think it is too stark a choice. It's perfectly reasonable to ask hero or villain. I would argue that he's a hero, but at the same time, it's very difficult, especially for Indians, to appreciate that, owing to the fact that he didn't like Indians. It's very clear he was a racist, as you'd expect from a late Victorian British aristocrat who, like so many other people of his generation, including people on the left, like H.G. Wells and the Webbs, for example, indeed Karl Marx, did believe in biological racism, in the Darwinian theory that your skin pigmentation affected the level of development and civilization that you had. It's a monstrous, disgusting, obscene idea, as we all know today. But back in his time, it was considered scientific. And so it is difficult for Indians, I think, to appreciate this man as a hero because of the terrible things that he said about you. However, when one actually looks at the things that he did, the way in which he warned against the rise of Hitler and the Nazis, the way in which he fought them, the way in which he planned their downfall and executed it, one should forget about the fact that he didn't like Indians, in the same way that as a Briton, David Cannadine and we are both British, and Napoleon said that we were a nation of shopkeepers. He despised us. It doesn't stop me, at least, from thinking that Napoleon is a great man. Thomas Jefferson couldn't stand the English either. He too was a great man, penned one of the greatest documents of freedom. And Charles de Gaulle, all sorts of people despised the British. But we are able to rise above that. And I want you also tonight to rise above that and to see Churchill in the round as a hero. Thank you very much.
As an editor of the National Biography, I think it falls upon you, David Cannadine, to often make rounded assessments of people. How would you assess Winston Churchill?
Well, I think that I find myself in considerable agreement with what Andrew has just said, though in the interests of liveliness, not completely. I don't find this notion of hero or villain a particularly helpful way of setting up a debate about Churchill, or indeed a debate about almost anybody. I suppose one might want to make the case that someone like Nelson Mandela was an unequivocal hero, though not everybody would share that view. That Hitler was an unadulterated villain. I think most people would share that view. But I think for most historical personalities of significance, and those in a British context are the ones that interest me as editor of the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, there's a kind of spectrum from hero to villain, and people occupy positions at various points along it. Churchill, in my view, certainly is much more to the hero side than to the villain side, if that's what we're being invited to say. And like most historically significant figures, he is an amalgam of the two, but the proportioning is, of course, unique and specific to him. I think beyond that, by way of openers, I would simply want to point out that, as with many people of his generation who held the sort of views on race that they all did, Churchill's private opinions, although they were much publicly stated on the subject of South Asians, but Churchill's, as it were, personal opinions were not necessarily the same as the ones that he accepted and believed in when he was holding public office. So in fact, as both colonial undersecretary, his first government job from 1905 to 1908, and as Secretary of State for the colonies in the immediate aftermath of the First World War, Churchill very strongly believed the official view that in the British Empire, all of the subjects of his or her imperial majesty were equal before the law, whatever their skin colour might be. And whatever he said about South Asians, as it were, personally, that was the official position, which in fact he championed very strongly. And although, of course, it's the case that the campaign that he mounted against the Government of India Act is more, I think, than a footnote to his career, and more indeed than a footnote to the history of this country, it's important to remember that, as it were, 10 years or more before that, Churchill, as colonial secretary, sacked General Dyer because he regarded him responsible for the Amritsar massacre, and he thought that was unacceptable. So even in terms of his attitude towards India, it's like most things about Churchill, it's much more complicated, and in my view, much more interesting, when you start to look more closely and more carefully at different aspects of Churchill's life. And if one does that, then certainly if I'm being asked to decide, as it were, whether Churchill was a hero or a villain, then he's certainly much more towards a hero. And I don't think he was ever a villain. I think he was a flawed figure, as we all are. He had the prejudices and presumptions of his time, which no longer seem right to us today, as we all do. And so I certainly wouldn't want to make the case that he was a figure without fault or flaw, least of all in his attitudes towards South Asia. But all that said, like most great historical figures, not all of them, but most of them, the reason that we still find him interesting is because, notwithstanding his drawbacks and the controversies surrounding those, he was a remarkable figure of substantial stature.
Well, I think we've got two clear positions there. One is the argument that if you look at Churchill in terms of his sustained opposition to appeasement, his role as a wartime leader, that somehow overrides his other flaws which stemmed from a context a historical context, which was that. Now, would you, if you were to stop being a historian and become an Indian, would you be so generous in terms of looking not only at the India bill, which I agree with David Cannadine, is a far more complicated, and it was as much to do with his harassment of the Baldwin government, internal conflicts within the Conservative Party, as much as it had to do with India. But more important are the choices he exercised during the Bengal famine of 1942-43, particularly the diversion of ships which carrying wheat from Australia, and the procurement. You know the whole thing. So how would you, today, would you wear your national hat and judge Churchill? Or would you judge Churchill as a historical figure where the flag is quite incidental?
Well, Swapan, as the only woman on this panel today, I'm going to speak not as an Indian, but actually as a woman. And and I'm also going to jump in at the villain end, and I'm going to just relate a story to you. This is UK, 1910. It's the 18th of November, and the suffragists are marching. They're marching in Westminster, and they have been, at this time, Churchill is the Home Secretary, and he has given instructions to the police that they can batter the women, and they can sexually, well, it's not instructions, it's not obviously written down, but they've been given the leeway to, assault the women and sexually assault them as well. And hundreds of women march in front of Parliament, and they are assaulted. There are also policemen in civilian clothes in the audience, in the crowds, and they batter the women. They put their hands up their thighs, they grope them, they press their breasts. And when one woman cried out, the policeman said, "Today I've been told I can do anything." There was a lot of writing in the media. He was absolutely, he was criticized in the press, but Churchill, Home Secretary, did not take responsibility, and he did not prosecute the police officials because he didn't want the women coming up and giving their view. So for me, right now, I'm not even speaking as an Indian or somebody who lives in Britain. I am speaking as a woman, and this definitely puts him on the villain scale. But we'll come to Bengal famine and all later. I'm sure those will come up.
Can I just point out that that's completely untrue? He at no stage ever okayed the sexual assault of any woman at any stage. There is no evidence to suggest that's true. It would have been a monstrous thing were it to be true, but there is no evidence for it.
Well, he didn't give instructions, as I said, but it was there. They were allowed. There were policemen in civilian clothes. They battered the women. It's in the media, and they never had a prosecution. I mean, we can go on arguing about this, but it's your word against mine.
I mean, take no prisoners was a very familiar motto at that time, and whether that was very crudely applied by certain Home Secretaries at that particular point is an issue of debate. But Pavan, you have no such inhibitions about calling yourself an Indian at this point. And if you were to look at Churchill from your perspective, and that is a very sort of, if you were to look at the perspective, Churchill from the perspective of Middle India, if I may use that term for you, since you represent aspects of politics which can be called Middle India politics, how would you see?
Well, you see, I see that the narrative of history cannot be split into black or white narratives. And I can't think of anyone, as David said, who has no redeeming features. But unfortunately, where I stand depends on where I sit. And I sit here as an Indian, and I'm taking full advantage of historical hindsight. And I don't have the indulgence granted to Mr. Churchill by his latter-day biographers, who try and see what the redeeming features are as against what Indians actually had to face. In my view, a hero is that person who is able to transcend the prejudices of his time, to look beyond them, to see where history is going. And I can name a great many people from the West who saw that writing on the wall and adjusted, modified, changed their prejudices because they saw that they were wrong. Mr. Churchill, in his imperial hubris, not only reinforced them, but was unwilling to believe that he could be wrong. Secondly, I think Mr. Churchill outlived his historical utility towards the end. He did not.
When?
I think before India's independence, he was a man who lived more in the past rather than a man who understood the realities of the present and what was required to create bridges of transition in the best interests of the British themselves. Thirdly, I think Mr. Churchill, influenced by his abominable prejudices, did not have any notion of historical exactitude. About India, he once said that to say that India is a nation is to say the equator is one. In other words, he was convinced that but for the benign guiding hand of the British, there was nothing that could be called Indian. And I'd like to remind some of those who believe in that theory of imperialism as the instrument that created India, that about a millennia before, we had, for instance, the great philosopher Shankaracharya, who was born in Kerala and who set up mutts or monastic orders across the Indian subcontinent, in Dwarka in the west, in Puri in the east, and in the Himalayas, Kedarnath in the north. In other words, India as a civilization, including at the political level, had pre-existed the British. The British may have given it an administrative framework to suit their colonial needs. But Mr. Churchill was not bothered about either the fine print or the broader historical narrative, which was not congruent to his imperialistic point of view. And there were many like that. And the worst part is the genuflection that ignorant Indians show to what should have been condemned then and needs to be condemned today. Edwin Lutyens, for instance, his letters to his wife are full of the most concentrated form of racist dismissal of anything which was not white in color, and in particular, his condemnation of anything related to art and culture in India he considered India to be an infantile, primitive civilization. So it is these kind of prejudices which need to be brought into the sunlight, judged objectively, and rather than be put into a framework where you find this great balancing mechanism to judge whether someone was completely wrong or could possibly have been in a minor way right.
Okay, now that's an interesting point, and I think we need to probe. We had Churchill and empire. Was Churchill's view, even by the standards of the mid-20th century, completely out of sync with anything that was common sense in Britain and in the rest of the country? I mean, for instance, Curzon, another great foreign secretary, and previously the viceroy, had very definite views on India, but it was empire, a belief in empire, couched with a romanticism as far as India was concerned. Now, was Churchill really completely out of sync? Was he a sort of unrepentant, crude reactionary?
It would have been very interesting to see what would have happened with regard to Curzon at the time of the Indian constitutional debate, because of course he died by then. But the phrase that he made about India being no more a nation than the equator was a warning that after Indian independence, inevitably the Indian empire was going to split up between countries like Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, which is something that, of course, did happen. It was a warning, and it was a warning that came to pass. As far as his long battle in the 1930s, of course, defeated battle. Ultimately, he lost. The Government of India Act passed in 1935 was concerned. His many worries First, of course, was that there would be a huge amount of corruption in India when the British left. The second was that he feared that there would be communal riots and massacres, especially up in the Punjab after the British left. These are, and of course also that the princes and the princely states would lose their power and influence. These are things that seem very much in the past now, and obviously do look very reactionary and old-fashioned. He only spoke for about 60 Tory MPs there. But the point was that it was not a vicious, unpleasant, aggressive attitude. It was something that he learnt, of course, as a subaltern up on the northwest frontier in the 1890s, and which he truly believed. He believed that the British were doing the Indians good by ruling them. Now, today, of course, that sounds absolutely absurd. However, at the time, according to his own lights, he was willing to put his own life at risk protecting Indians in the northwest frontier. He actually was a true believer in that, and I don't think that that's something that can be mocked or ridiculed.
Yeah, that's quite an interesting point of view. But, nevertheless, Churchill, as far as most Britons were concerned, and I guess that sort of extended to across the Atlantic, was an inspirational leader. I think we can underline his faults, but I don't think there's any ambiguity about the fact that from the period 1940 onwards, or at least till 45, he epitomized and he created a national resolve. Now, how much did this baggage, or did this sustained belief in empire, or a belief in a sort of manifest destiny of Britain play a role in?
Well, I think it's one of the indications of the significance of Churchill's life, not only that it was a hugely long life, and that requires very careful evaluation precisely because of its length, because things changed as he lived out his long public career. He also changed his views as he lived out his long public career. But it's also that he had and has different resonances in different parts of the world, some of which he knew well, some of which he knew less well. So that, for example, on the whole, not entirely, he is still regarded as a heroic figure in Britain. There's more revisionist scholarship about Churchill undertaken in Britain, I think, than anywhere else. I think he plays very well in America, though increasingly, I think, among Republicans rather than among Democrats. I think his resonance in Australia is quite complicated. I think that many Anglophiles in Australia still think well of him, but he's also, of course, the man who's thought to be responsible for the Dardanelles, which is an essential episode in the Australia's narrative of its own coming to self-consciousness as a nation. And he's not altogether well thought of because in the Second World War he's more interested in defending Britain from the Germans than Australia from the Japanese. And then in India, he is as controversial as I think we've already established, and there are good reasons why. So I think, in a sense, it's rather like, is he a hero or is he a villain? The answer, in fact, is it's all very complicated, which may seem like a mealy-mouthed response, but it seems to me it's part of the job and the obligation of historians to probe beneath these simple stereotypes and binary categories of praise and denigration to get to a rather more complicated and nuanced version of the truth. And in Churchill's case, because he was a global figure for much of his life, and it was a very long life, it is indeed all very complicated.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the complications, Shrabani, because I'm going to come right back to you. The question is it fair? Is it appropriate to judge Winston Churchill, a very complicated figure with a very long life, with a legacy which touches all parts of the globe, purely in terms of his rather callous attitude towards the famine in Bengal in 43?
I would call it a little more serious than just a callous attitude, Chaput.
Sorry, I fell back on understatement.
Yes, it wasn't just a can you hear me? I think, okay. It wasn't just a callous attitude. He was warned. to give you the brief potted history of the Bengal famine, you probably all know about this, but in 1943, there was a Bengal famine, 3 million. Official figures are 1.5 dead, but the estimate is that 3 million died. And the shortage was caused because, despite warnings, severe warnings, once Burma was occupied, the rice bowl, was occupied, and the rice wasn't coming into Bengal. And despite this, they were exporting. They were made to export grain to countries which couldn't reach it. So grain was exported to Ceylon. And he was warned that if this extent of export happens, when the rice isn't coming in, there's going to be a crisis. But he didn't act on it. He was fine with it. He said he sent grain instead to Europe, where they had enough, but they kept it. There's a quote I have in this diary. It's quite awful. He said that we have enough grain, we can now feed it to the poultry farmers, so the poultry farmers can feed it to the chickens, and then we'll have more eggs. There were people dying, 3 million dying in Bengal. I've heard stories, my father told me, he was a young boy then, and I'm from Bengal, and he would say that he could hear these people on the streets begging for, they would say pande, which means give us starch. There was no rice, but the starch we throw away after boiling the rice, they wanted that. And they said, just give us that. And they were dead, they were just, the images went round. And when he was shown these images by his own people, so he just said, why isn't Gandhi dead then? So, it's not just the callous remarks that he made, they are really deadly serious. People died. And then he refused to get aid. So even Germany allowed aid to Greece when there was a famine in Greece. Churchill didn't. He said, no, the ships can't be diverted. There was ships from Australia which could have come. Canada offered ships and grain. He didn't allow it because he couldn't divert the ships. When Australia said they could load the ships, the Australian ships bypassed the Indian ports, past the starving people, and went to Europe to stockpile for when the liberation was over. So there is a lot more that goes into this. He has a lot to answer for, just with regard to the Bengal famine. But I agree with David, it's very complicated. I do confess that. Because on the other hand, I have worked on the Second World War. I've worked on this special, I've done a biography of Noor Inayat Khan, who was a secret agent in the Second World War. And she was part of the SOE, which was a crack organization set up by Churchill to go set Europe ablaze. So as a wartime leader, he was great. I've spoken to pilots who are now veterans, and they say, they did it just because of Churchill. So, there is definitely that element of him. But I think the British people knew what they were doing. They kept him as the wartime leader, threw him out as prime minister.
Churchill exercised very tough options. One of the reasons why he diverted ships from Australia to Britain was because he wanted to ease the extent of deprivation as far as wartime rationing was concerned domestically. Now that's a sort of a choice a politician makes. It's not necessarily a choice which a statesman makes. Would that be a fair comment?
No, it's the choice a grand strategist makes when the Japanese are in charge of the Andaman Islands and therefore can sink the ships that are coming to Bengal, whereas they're not necessarily going to be able to do that when they're protected by the Royal Navy getting to Britain. It was, in fact, the Churchill who got in touch with Roosevelt to try and get grain from America, and we had a huge problem in that. It didn't just happened because the Japanese invaded Burma. It happened because in October 1942 there was a cyclone that destroyed the rice crop up to 40 miles inside what is modern-day Bangladesh, and they used the rice rather than planting it. So they had, by the next May, a huge problem on their hands, which it took a long time for this to get to the War Cabinet. It wasn't until October 1943, and when it did, Churchill attempted to send 200,000 tons worth of grain to Bengal. But again, we had lost 1.5 million tons of shipping in 1942. It was a shipping nightmare to try and get anything anywhere. And so what one should not do and cannot really do, unless one is trying to make him out to be some genocidal war criminal, which would require not just him, by the way, but the support of the Viceroy, the Bengal Legislative Council, which was Indian at the time, the Hindu merchants who were making a lot of money out of the sale of rice as well, and all sorts of other people involved in this horrific tragedy. The idea that he is in some way primarily responsible for what happened is completely ridiculous.
Well, if you've looked at the Wavell diaries, if you've looked at some of the private utterances of the then colonial secretary, I forget his name, Leo Amory, the exasperation felt by them when it came to Winston and India, sort of a blind spot. It would seem that in this case, something a little more than grand strategic calculations. I mean, it's not like opening the second front. It was something a little more than that. There was something almost visceral in this. Am I wrong? Would I be wrong in suggesting that there was almost something visceral here?
Well, at the risk of repeating what's been said and what I've said, it's more complicated than that. It's a very unwarm way of putting it, but part of the responsibilities of power, whether this is statesmanship or whether it's failing the test of statesmanship is debatable, is what economists call the allocation of scarce resources. And resources were very scarce at the time of the Bengal famine. Churchill allocated them one way for what he thought were justifiable reasons. Other people, for their good reasons, don't accept that. But there's no, as it were, agreed conclusion to reach about that. I think it's also hugely important to remember that one of Churchill's difficulties from his perspective, not I suspect from many people here today, but undeniably from his perspective, is that he finds himself in the Second World War with two allies without whom Britain will not be on the winning side, that's to say, the United States and Communist Russia. But they are two allies who are actually not much more sympathetic to the British Empire than the enemies that Churchill is fighting. And when Churchill famously says in 1942 or 43, "I have not become the King's first minister in order to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire," those remarks were as much addressed to Washington and to Moscow as they were to Tokyo and Berlin, and they were certainly addressed to Delhi too. Now, one may wish to take the view that Churchill is standing against the whole tenor of the 20th century, as I sense you feel, because imperialism was ending. But actually, of course, it is exactly the case that the Russian and the American empires were created on the ruin of the British. Churchill was rather against that, and that's a point of view which, from his perspective, seems to me wholly reasonable. And in particular, one of the problems that Churchill has, another of the problems about South Asia, beyond what to do about the Bengal famine, is that he was constantly being pressed by Roosevelt, who did not like the British Empire at all, to advance India towards self-government. And Roosevelt kept saying to Churchill, "Haven't you noticed how badly the White Street-coloured people in India?" To which Churchill replied, "Mr. President, have you been to the American South recently?" At which point Roosevelt shut up. So there are a very complicated set of issues going on. Now, I accept absolutely that Churchill's understanding of South Asia, the Pacific, was limited and much less well developed than his views about Europe, about Britain, and about North America. But this depiction of him as a man whose treatment of India is unequivocally evil and irresponsible does seem to me to be overdoing it.
You know, I must confess I'm a little fascinated by the repeated use of the word complicated. I find that that is actually one of the great pillars of revisionist history, to kind of create a situation where even with objective evaluation, without prejudice, you can come to a conclusion that somebody, any historical figure who played such a pivotal role, was motivated more by prejudice, motivated more by lack of concern for priorities he or she considered to be less relevant or unimportant or avoidable or ignorable. and to create around such decisions so many other extraneous factors which would make that decision almost palatable given the difficulty of making straightforward choices. And I think in this case of this whole revisionist project, people like Winston Churchill are the beneficiaries, especially, of historians who want to restore once again what appears now to be undoubtedly a person who had, as I said earlier, outlived his utility and was largely guided by the sentiments of an imperial era which had ceased to exist. And I must confess that very often these attempts are clearly transparent for what they are aiming at.
Well, you may not like revisionist history, but thank God for revisionist history, because that's what really keeps history going. I mean, it will be very boring. And in fact, the revisionism, as far as Churchill is concerned, is of very recent vintage. So which is revisionism? I'm not very terribly sure whether you're talking about the view of Churchill as an inspirational wartime leader, which held right till about the 1980s or so, or the figure of Churchill as a genocidal maniac which has recently come into being.
No, actually,
And far more, I would ask another question, which is interesting from the point of view, is when was it consciously recognized in the world that empire is obsolete? And when did the British themselves recognize it? When did the world recognize it? Or did World War II make empire merely unaffordable?
you see, the question you're asking, I keep going back to the original causes. I think Winston Churchill's ability to be among the first, if not the first, at least in the positions he held and the influence he exercised, his ability to be able to sense what is changing in terms of the historical narrative of what the future could be and what could be in the best interests of Britain as one phase ended and another began. I believe that ability was inherently stultified by the prejudices he held. Now, of course, when you say the use of the word complicated, if I was a British historian writing about Churchill's role in the Second World War, I would consider him in many ways to be a hero, because he did provide the leadership, and he's uncomplicated that wherever he saw the interests of the British or of the empire, he pursued it. But now the attempt that is dangerous is to show that beyond this, for a variety of reasons which makes the scenario complicated, he was also not as unconcerned or insensitive about issues which had a huge impact on millions of people. And Shrabani just mentioned the Bengal famine. And of course, you can point out a variety of reasons why. But the fact of the matter is that in his system of priorities, influenced by his prejudices, this was not important.
Yes, it would have. You had by that stage Japanese forces inside India, inside Assam, at Kohima and Imphal. You had the whole of the Malayan Peninsula had fallen. You had the Japanese greater economic sphere, co-prosperity sphere, as they called it, dominating that entire part of the world. It was something where we were attempting as much as possible to feed our own armies and not able to give quite the calories that we needed to do that. And so, as has been mentioned earlier, there were next to impossible decisions, decisions that none of us in this room would like to take for a moment, but somebody had to take them. And it's very easy for us 70 years later, knowing that we won the Second World War, knowing that the Japanese were flung back from Imphal and Kohima, to say that we should have dedicated huge amounts of shipping, much of it of which would have been sunk, to relieving that famine rather than fighting successfully the Second World War.
I think the question about empire that you posed is a very interesting one. I don't think anybody would surely argue that the age of empires is yet over. I don't think that Americans don't like being told that theirs is an imperial power, but of course it is. Putin is a very imperialist head of Russia. China is behaving in many ways like a 19th century European imperial power. And I'm sure I don't need to remind any of you that the Indian constitution actually says at some point that it's important to have an appropriate constitution for an empire. So if you want to study empire now, actually India is quite a good place to come.
Sorry, I didn't know about that clause. But
You might want to check that out.
No, I don't think that clause.
I can't tell you which article it is, but I can tell
What
you to
does it
check it
say?
No,
out.
no, but I think the sentiment is noble, but I don't think its presence is there in the Constitution as yet. It should be, perhaps. Now,
I'm just going to jump in on the ships for one moment, because I don't think the war would have been lost if these relief ships had been sent. They were ready, they could have been sent, and he didn't send, he didn't allow them. They went past the ports. I mean, that I find completely unacceptable. It would have been a minor, of course, they would have to send a few, but they would not have lost the war because of those ships, and people's lives would have been saved. That's just one small point. The other thing is to say that, this racist attitude is all right for those days. I do take issue with that. It wasn't everybody. His own, Wavell and Amory, they are so frustrated with Churchill when they write about it. Their diaries and the comments they make, that it's impossible, that his decisions are not, there's no rationale to them. And to say that, underfed Bengalis don't need to be fed over sturdy Greeks, that's a bit difficult to accept as
well, I
the
think
norm.
we won't ever come to a conclusion on that, but I just want to, the last round of questions which I want to ask is, Churchill is not remembered merely as a political leader. I think there was something more about Winston Churchill. And I think as his mastery over prose, his writings as a historian, even some of his journalistic pieces, which he did out of, for rather dodgy reasons, are worth looking at even now. Now, Andrew Roberts, you've probably read everything Churchill has written. How would you look back on?
He wrote 8 million words and spoke 6 million, and I'm not pretending that I've read every single word of them. But he deserved the Nobel Prize for Literature. It was an extraordinary output. Some people think that The World Crisis is still the best single work of military history ever written, and other people think that Marlborough, his Life of Marlborough, Leo Strauss called it the greatest biography of the 20th century. So, this is a giant when it comes to writing. When you mentioned the dodgy reasons he wrote, that was because he was constantly broke, owing to the fact that he spent much more money than he earned. He was a great spender of money. But Dr. Johnson said no man but a blockhead writes except for money. It's a perfectly reasonable reason to write endless amounts. And if it's of the kind of quality that still lives 100, 200 years later, then thank God for it.
Just as a footnote to that, when Baldwin once remarked that Winston has written a book about himself, and he's called it The World Crisis.
No, it's Balfour, not Baldwin.
Sorry.
I think one of the things that was extraordinary about Churchill was not just the elephantine length of his... One of the extraordinary things about Churchill was not just the elephantine length of his public career, rivaled in Britain only by Gladstone. He was in public life for the best part of 60 years. It was also the extraordinary range of talents and abilities, not just a long life as a statesman, as a politician, as an international figure, all of that being true nevertheless. It's also, of course, that he was, as Andrew has mentioned, a very extraordinary writer of histories, of biographies, and he was indeed a journalist, and some of the journalism was suspect, and most of it was done for money, but which journalist couldn't agree with all of that about them? So why shouldn't Churchill do it as well? And most of his journalism, or at least a lot of it, has lasted. But there was also, of course, the fact that he was quite a talented painter. He was quite a good bricklayer. And he owned and bred racehorses. He used to race his own horses against the Queen's in the early 1950s. I mean, there is a kind of extraordinary range of things that he could do, as well as, of course, the wit and the eloquence and the magnanimity. It's why, for example, I'd be interested to know what Andrew thinks about this. It seems to me he is intrinsically probably the most interesting figure to have been a British Prime Minister in terms of the sheer range of gifts. And I think, in that sense, he's a much more interesting figure than Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher is an interesting figure for many reasons, but she didn't have the hinterland, the range of interests that Churchill had. And of all British Prime Ministers, certainly of modern times, Churchill had the greatest range of interests and the most extraordinary energy with which he pursued them all.
If you just, may I add something after you?
No, this is just an amusing thing about him spending a lot, because he has this, in Bangalore Club, he couldn't pay his bills, so they have this famous thing that he owes 13 rupees. In 1888 or 18, I don't know, I can't, Andrew would know the date. It's there, and they frame it. And there were a lot of people, a lot of Britishers who wanted to repay that bill. They wouldn't allow them. They said, no, we want him listed as a defaulter. So he's a defaulter.
No, there's no doubt that he was in many ways a fascinating personality. If for nothing else, for his wit and humor and repartee and his abilities to put his political or otherwise any opponents in place, I mean, he had. And I must say that the range of qualities that you just described would make him a very appealing Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. But unfortunately, history will judge him on a larger canvas. And as far as winning the Nobel Prize for Literature, I mean, I'm very happy he did. But I just want to add as a small footnote, these were highly politicized decisions. Not that he didn't deserve enough recognition for literature. I just want to mention to you, it's probably part of historical record, that perhaps the one man recognized globally as the biggest messiah of peace, recognized even in Britain, Mahatma Gandhi, was recommended 14 times for the Nobel Prize for Peace and never got it.
Neither did Churchill.
Well, we can only say that Kipling got it, and he was probably arguably the best chronicler of India. I think that's it. I think I'll just, I think we've heard a lot of contentious, provocative, sober, reflective, etc. comments. Now, I'm sure there's a lot of people who have some question. Okay.
Hello, sir. I was hello. Are you able to hear me? My question is mainly to the. It's open for anyone to come in on the panel. For a lot of reasons, worldwide, Churchill is mostly remembered for being the wartime leader who won the Second World War. My question is, if hypothetically the war was lost, would we still be looking at Churchill in the same light, all his other, let's say, war atrocities, if you can say them, in the famine or something like that, or other things? Would we be still praising him for other stuff that we are right now, or would we be looking at the entirely another picture of Churchill if the war was lost?
Who's going to start the what if school?
I love what if history, and happy with that one. If the war had been lost because the Japanese had successfully invaded India, you would have found that they would have treated India in the same way as they treated the Philippines, where 17% of their population, the Filipino population, died between 1941 and 1945. So frankly, the horrors that would have befallen India would have been so horrific that you probably wouldn't have been worrying about the post-war reputation of Winston Churchill in the first place. But there were many other things that he did beyond the Second World War. The first thing, of course, as far as Britons are concerned, is he made the Navy ready for the First World War. He saved us from any danger of attack from the Germans at the beginning of the First World War. But there were all sorts of things in every office he touched. He was a liberalizing Home Secretary, for example. He was somebody who championed free trade. He created the beginnings of the British welfare state. He did all sorts of things that would mean that historians would still have to take him seriously, even if, say, he died in 1939 before the Second World War broke out.
Well, if the Second World War had been won by Germany and Japan rather than by Russia and America and Britain, then we would be having this conversation in Japanese, or if we were having a similar session in the United Kingdom, we would be having that conversation in German.
Any more questions? Gentlemen here, then. Okay, whichever order. Just use the mic, please.
Some of us will have seen the Netflix blockbuster The Queen. Do you think on a personal level that reflected the crowd? Do you think on a personal level that reflected Churchill's behavior at that time?
Not during the coronation. He was stone cold sober during the coronation.
There's something to be said for a man who conducts public life having a glass of diluted whiskey throughout the day. Sorry if I'm... Yeah, I know. But, yeah.
Sorry, can you stand up and different mic. दूसरा mic ले लीजिए.
Yeah, so very clear about why he's considered as a sort of a villainous figure in the Indian population right now. But also wanted to understand how much of him having a hero status in the Britain is an outcome of the failure of the desired outcomes of, let us say, Neville Chamberlain's regime and his wartime efforts, especially after the Warsaw Agreement between Germany and the Soviet Union.
I'm not sure I really got the hang of that question. Did
So,
you?
I mean, how much of a credit goes to probably Neville Chamberlain's failures as for Winston Churchill to have a hero status?
Okay, I see what you're saying. Contrasting
Yeah,
Chamberlain's
as a pe-
pusillanimity against
Exactly, yeah.
Churchill's role.
Very, very important, of course, in the 1930s when he woke people up to the danger specifically of the Luftwaffe and the German air menace. But also that key moment when he denounced the Munich Agreement in October 1938. And then from that moment on, when nobody agreed with him, nobody supported him, in November 1938, he actually had only 2 people vote on his side in a House of Commons motion to set up a Ministry of Supply. And all the way through until the moment on the 15th of March 1939 when Hitler invaded the rump of Czechoslovakia and occupied Prague, which let everybody know the real Hitler, as it were. For those over 5 months, when he was totally in the wilderness, and he kept banging the same drum, he kept saying the same thing, and because he was because he was the sole person doing it, he reaped the rewards when it became clear that everything that he had been saying was true and more.
The problem that British policymakers faced in the 1930s in broad geopolitical terms was that they had an overextended empire, a weak economy, and insufficient military to defend the empire in all its global distribution. And what British policymakers in the 30s were terrified by was the prospect of having Japan as the enemy in Asia, which would mean an extended land war and probably naval war as well. A war against Italy in the Mediterranean, which would threaten the Suez Canal and hence threaten Britain's position in India, and a war against Germany on the continent, in the North Sea, and potentially in the Atlantic. And every British policymaker and leader and military advisor is terrified at that prospect because Britain simply lacked the resources to fight all those wars against those 3 enemies in all those different parts of the world. And that was the rationale, the justification to the extent that there was one, for appeasement, the hope that you could fend off maybe Italy, maybe Japan, maybe Germany, by letting Japan invade Manchuria, by letting Italy invade Abyssinia and hoping they'd be satisfied with that, and by appeasing Germany. Not, to put it mildly, a noble or heroic policy, but one could see the reasons why it was thought to be the only way to go. Churchill was absolutely right in his sense in the second half of the 1930s that this wasn't working and that it was all going wrong. And about that, he certainly deserves, at least from a British perspective, the thanks of posterity. But in fact, of course, when Churchill becomes Prime Minister, that's exactly the problem that he is stuck with. That in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, Britain is fighting Germany in Europe, Italy in the Mediterranean, and Japan in the Far East and in India. And it's an impossible position for the British to maintain without the support of America and of Russia. So while Churchill was right that appeasement was a dishonorable policy, which I think it was, it assumed that Hitler could be trusted, which he couldn't. Even at the time, people said, well, these are wonderful speeches denouncing appeasement, but what is Churchill's alternative policy? And he sort of hadn't got one.
No, he had, because from 1936 onwards, he supported collective security and tried to bring Russia in on the side of the Allies, and not very successfully, of course, because ultimately Russia joined Hitler in August 1939. But that doesn't mean that he didn't have a credible, intelligent policy. It was just the one that where Stalin was always going to be able to outbid us.
Well, also appeasement was intensely popular. I mean, after Munich, the popularity of appeasement, I think in hindsight, we tend to think of appeasement as a dirty word, but it did have popular currency at that time. There was a lady there. Yes, please. I'm sorry the light blinded me.
Yeah, it's really significant that you're having this debate on a day when Trump enters the White House. And just sitting back here at the end of this hall, I was just wondering whether 50 years from now you were to judge Trump, and let's presume that in the next couple of years there was actually a third world war or whatever, fourth world war. I think we're already in a third world war. And he happened to win that with the allies, whoever are with him. Would you still, 50 years from now, would we say all the obnoxious things that he's said about women, all the obnoxious things that he's done to women, all the obnoxious things that he's said about immigrants, would that all just be forgiven because he won the war, the hypothetical war? After all, people who are abused do have memory.
It's very tempting to go into that department, that entire area of Donald Trump. I wouldn't like to censor anybody's comments on that, nor necessarily prejudge Trump. But just as I'll give the final comments to them if they want to talk about Donald Trump. I think everyone's welcome. There was a last question on Churchill. Now I've got a choice of 3 and I've got 2 minutes. Go on, you take a pick. Which one? Straight, gentlemen.
Maybe to end it on a lighter note, why do you think the relationship between Lady Astor and Winston Churchill creates such an abundance of witty, quotable repartee?
Well, we all know the jokes about Churchill and Lady Astor, so I won't repeat them now. I think that what was interesting about that relationship was, of course, that Lady Astor was teetotal. Nobody ever described Churchill as being teetotal. And Churchill, though he didn't treat women as badly as perhaps has been suggested here, or authorised the treatment of women in that way, Churchill was initially opposed to suffragettes, and of course Nancy Astor was the first British woman not to be elected to the House of Commons, but to take her seat in the House of Commons. So they kind of rubbed each other up the wrong way, and I think they both actually rather enjoyed the process.
And of course, they weren't total enemies all their lives. When you look at the Clifton guest books, you see that Winston Churchill used to stay there in the 1930s, which he wouldn't have been invited to have done had he been a sworn enemy. And when it came to the key vote in May, 8th of May 1940, that ultimately made Churchill Prime Minister, Lady Astor was one of the people who voted against Neville Chamberlain, tried to bring Neville Chamberlain down. And of course, she was American, and Churchill was always being accused on the right of the Conservative Party of being a half American firebrand, you know. So he had a much more interesting, much more complicated relationship than the anecdotes suggest.
I don't know whether we should leave Donald Trump to get on with his inauguration.
We live in fear.
Some people live in fear, some people live in great expectation. I think that is a matter of opinion. I would only say that, you know, not everybody is alarmed by Trump. Some people see it as a new style. Whether that style is too abrasive, whether that style marks a departure from Churchillian conservatism is quite obvious, but I think it is. I think the next few years will certainly be exciting, and I think we all look forward with expectation and trepidation.
Of course, we have heard that Donald Trump has moved the bust of Sir Winston Churchill into the Oval Office, which is something that should be welcomed. Something tells me, though, that it wouldn't have happened the other way around. I doubt that Churchill would move a bust of Donald Trump into his office.
The point of the question was well made, in that reputations do go up and down. I said reputations, I think I've been switched off, yes. Reputations do go up and down. One of the quotations from Shakespeare, which I think all historians should remember, is in Othello. Somebody says, "Reputation is a most idle and false disposition, oft got without merit and lost without deserving." And it's a very potent and telling phrase. And I think, as historians, one of our subjects of interest is the way that reputations go up and down after people have died. I think our problem with Donald Trump is that he's still very much alive.
We would like to thank our esteemed panel for this interesting discussion. Andrew Roberts, David Cannadine, Shrabani Basu, Pavan Varma, in conversation with Mr. Swapan Dasgupta. Thank you so much. Music stage tickets are available at tent number 2 or at Hotel Clark's Amer, where the event is happening. We hope to see you there. Thank you so much.
Man made money, money made man, we go mad for more money. Give me the cash, the dollar bill, yo. If me don't get it, you know me ready to kill. Say, capitalistic beast, no one human rights.